All right, so today we're diving into this case that's making the rounds online, and it's being called twisted for a reason.
Yeah, you really get that impression once you hear the specifics.
It's not just some, cut and dry legal thing. This is the story of Renisha McBride,
19 years old.
19 years old, yeah. And she died tragically on a rainy November night
Back in 2013.
back in 2013
Yeah.
in Dearborn Heights, Michigan.
Interesting location, right? Dearborn Heights had a bit of a reputation back then, a lot of crime.
Yeah.
And you have to picture this 4:30 a.m. pouring rain, and you hear someone banging on your door.
Oh, man.
It's a recipe for fear, right?
Oh, yeah. Nobody wants to be in that situation.
Nobody.
So Renisha, she had been in a car accident earlier that night.
Right.
And we know from the 911 call that she hit a parked car.
Oh, wow.
And she seemed really disoriented, potentially had a head injury.
Okay.
And she walked away from the scene, which is
Is that good?
not good, no. And hours later, she ends up on the porch of Theodore Wafer,
Right, the homeowner.
the homeowner who ultimately shot and killed her.
And it's Wafer's 911 call after the shooting that really gets things going.
Right. It just throws everything into question.
He claims he accidentally shot her.
He says he didn't know the gun was loaded.
Right, which, you hear that and you think, okay, maybe it was an accident.
You want to give him the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah, but then when you look at all the details of the case, especially the evidence, it makes you wonder,
Oh, yeah.
did things really happen the way he says they did?
Exactly. So let's get into that evidence.
Okay.
The police found Renisha dead on the porch.
Single gunshot wound
To the head?
to the head.
And that right there already raises questions about this whole accident thing, doesn't it?
Absolutely a gunshot to the head. It suggests intent,
Yeah.
and it goes against this idea of, just a random accidental shot.
So then we look at the interrogation video.
Things get even more interesting there.
Oh, yeah.
Wafer's behavior, the inconsistencies in his story, they really jump out at you.
It's like watching his story fall apart in real time.
Yeah.
He's so nervous. He's fumbling his words. He even tries to use his Miranda rights.
It shows you right away he understands how serious this is.
Yeah.
And it's more than just nerves. The way
Yeah.
he tries to assert his rights, it's ineffective.
Oh.
Like he's not thinking clearly.
He's grasping at straws.
Yeah, grasping at any legal defense he can think of, even if he doesn't really get it.
And it's not just what he's saying, it's his body language, too.
Right, the nonverbal cues are huge.
Crossing his arms, shifting in his seat, avoiding eye contact.
He's closing himself off,
Oh, yeah.
trying to put a barrier between himself and the people questioning him.
Like he's hiding something.
That kind of behavior,
Yeah.
you see it a lot when someone's feeling guilty or trying to hide information.
So we've got a young woman looking for help who ends up dead, a homeowner claiming it was an accident, but the evidence says otherwise, and then a suspect acting super suspicious during questioning.
It's a lot to take in.
Where do we even go from here with this?
Well, to get the legal side of this, we need to look at Michigan's Castle Doctrine.
Okay.
Basically, it says homeowners can use deadly force against intruders
Makes sense.
if they reasonably believe their life's in danger.
Right, so that's what Rafer's leaning on.
Exactly.
But did he really believe his life was in danger when he met Renisha on his porch?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And that's where things got heated during the trial.
Between the prosecution and the defense?
Yep, remember the whole thing about reasonable fear?
Yeah.
It all comes down to that the jury had to decide were Wafer's actions justified based on what was happening, and would a normal person in that situation have felt the same level of threat?
Right. Tough call.
And from what we know so far, a young woman who's probably disoriented after a car accident,
Right.
it's hard to see how she was a real danger to Wafer's life.
It's especially tricky because Wafer chose to open the door.
He went out to her,
Yeah, he confronted her instead of calling the police.
which seems like that could work against his self-defense argument. Potentially by engaging with her, he created a risk that might not have been there otherwise.
So he basically inserted himself into the problem instead of getting away from it.
It makes it harder to believe he was truly scared for his life.
And then his story changes, doesn't it, between the interrogation and the trial?
Oh yeah, one of the most interesting parts of this whole thing.
During questioning, he's all about the accidental misfire.
But then at the trial, he switches to self-defense,
Oh, wow.
saying he was scared and felt threatened by Renisha.
Like he's tailoring his story to fit whatever defense seems best.
Sounds about right, but did it work?
Did the jury buy it?
Not at all. The judge actually threw out the self-defense claim.
Wow.
Said Renisha's actions didn't justify using deadly force.
So they found him guilty?
Guilty on all charges.
All of them.
Second-degree murder, manslaughter, felony firearm possession.
Wow. So that's it, right? Justice is served, case closed?
Not quite. There's a twist. The Michigan Supreme Court gets involved.
They overturned part of the verdict.
The manslaughter conviction, to be exact.
Wait, how can they do that?
It had to do with a legal conflict with the second-degree murder charge.
I don't get it.
Okay, so second-degree murder needs malice.
Okay.
A clear intent to kill or cause serious harm.
Right.
Manslaughter, though it implies a lack of malice.
So more like an accident.
Kind of. It means the killing wasn't intentional, but it was reckless.
Oh.
The court said having both convictions violated Weaver's rights. They were basically saying two opposite things.
Okay, so they got rid of the manslaughter charge.
But the second-degree murder stuck.
So did his sentence change?
Nope, it stayed the same, 15 to 30 years.
Wow.
His lawyer argued that for a 55-year-old man, that's basically a life sentence anyway.
So even with the Supreme Court stepping in, Wafer's fate was sealed.
It seems that way.
But this whole thing, it just raises so many questions about the legal system, about self-defense laws, about how fear and perception play into these situations.
Definitely.
Can we ever really know what happened that night?
It's hard to say.
And was justice really served?
That's a tough one. That's the thing with cases like this. The legal system, it wants clear answers. But sometimes those answers just aren't there.
Yeah,
And that's what makes this deep dive so interesting.
for sure.
We're not just looking at what happened in court. We're looking at how people act,
Right.
how they see things, and how our choices can have these crazy unintended consequences.
Exactly. And there's still more to uncover.
Right? Like that 3-hour gap,
Between Renisha's accident and when she got to Wafer's house.
that missing piece could tell us a lot about what she was thinking.
Yeah, and what led her to that final encounter.
Exactly. Let's go back to that 911 call right after Renisha's accident.
The one where they say she's acting all confused after she hit that parked car.
That's the one.
Yeah.
The caller even mentioned she might be under the influence.
Oh, wow.
Plus, maybe a head injury.
Oh.
Sounds like someone who's not thinking straight.
Yeah, that could explain why she walked away from the crash instead of waiting for help.
It's not the usual thing to do, is it?
Not real.
Most people would stay put, especially if they're hurt. But her actions suggest she wasn't thinking rationally.
So then what? She just vanishes for 3 hours.
3 hours where we have no clue where she went or what she was doing.
That's what keeps people guessing.
The big blank spot. Her family says she was just lost and looking for help,
Makes sense.
wandering around until she reached Wafer's porch.
Especially with the weather, and if she was injured, anyone would be desperate for help on a night like that.
Absolutely. But
Yeah.
since we don't know what happened during those 3 hours, it leaves room for other theories.
Like what?
Some people wonder if she ran into anyone else during that time.
Or if something else happened, that might explain why she was acting that way.
It's unsettling to think about knowing how it all ended. And it's hard to ignore how this missing time plays into a bigger issue in this case.
You mean the racial aspect?
Yeah, it's a sensitive subject.
For sure.
But you can't ignore the fact that she was a young black woman and she ended up dead on the porch of a white homeowner.
In a mostly white neighborhood.
Exactly. And this wasn't just any neighborhood either.
What do you mean?
There was a history of racial tension there, which adds another layer to the story.
We can't just sweep that under the rug.
Definitely not.
Yeah.
It's tragic.
Yeah.
But cases like this where unarmed black people are killed in questionable circumstances, they're becoming way too common.
It makes you wonder about implicit bias.
For sure.
And whether race played a role in how Wafer saw Renisha.
Did he see her as a threat because she was black?
Would things have been different if she had been a young white woman asking for help?
It's a question that stays with you even if we can't know for sure.
It makes you think about the bigger picture.
Absolutely. Systemic racism, how it affects how people see each other and how they act, and the awful consequences that can come from that.
So where does that leave us? We have a guilty verdict, but it doesn't feel like justice was completely served.
We have a system that's supposed to uphold the law,
Mm.
but sometimes it struggles with the human side of things.
And the history behind these kinds of situations.
It shows us that legal outcomes don't always equal true justice. And it leaves us asking, what could have been done differently?
That night, and in the bigger picture of racial inequality.
It's heavy stuff.
Yeah.
But before we wrap up, let's go back to Theodore Wafer's behavior.
Throughout the whole thing.
Yeah, especially during the interrogation.
His actions say a lot, don't you think?
How so?
The way he stumbles over his words, his nervous body language, how he tries to use his Miranda rights but messes it up.
Sounds like someone who knows they messed up big time.
And his first story about it being an accident, it just doesn't add up.
When you look at the evidence.
Right, the physical evidence contradicts him. And then he changes his story, which makes him seem even less believable.
It's like he's trying to run away from what he did.
First, it's an accident, then it's self-defense. Like he's desperate for any excuse.
And even at trial, he doesn't do himself any favors.
No remorse, no empathy for Renisha or her family.
He's just stone-faced, even though the judge didn't believe his self-defense claim.
It's that lack of empathy that gets you, even if he was scared. His inability to acknowledge the loss of life is disturbing.
It makes you question who he is and why he did what he did.
You're left with this uneasy feeling, even though there was a conviction. And it makes you think, what if Theodore Wafer had just not opened that door?
What if he had called the police instead of going out to face Renisha?
Would this whole thing have been avoided?
It's a question that haunts this case.
A chain of decisions driven by fear, maybe even prejudice, led to something that can't be undone. This case forces us to face the fact that what we do, even if we think we're protecting ourselves, can have terrible consequences.
It's a lot to think about, and it shows how important it is to understand each other, to be compassionate, and to question our own biases so we can stop these kinds of tragedies from happening again.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
But before we get into the bigger societal issues, let's look at one more important detail.
What's that?
The weapon itself.
The shotgun.
The Mossberg.
Yeah.
How it was stored, how it was loaded. It raises even more questions about what Wafer did that night.
Right. Like what specifically?
Well, when they questioned him, he said he wasn't sure if it was loaded.
Really?
He said he had loaded it weeks before because he was paranoid after some kids were playing paintball nearby.
Okay.
But he insisted he didn't realize there was a bullet in the chamber.
That seems careless, especially for someone who says they were worried about safety.
Right. It makes you think, if he wasn't sure about the gun, why even point it at someone, let alone pull the trigger?
It doesn't add up.
His actions show a level of recklessness that's more than just a mistake. It casts doubt on the whole accident story and points to either not caring about safety or doing something on purpose without thinking about the consequences.
So not a good look for Wafer.
Not at all. And it highlights how important it is to be responsible with guns and to be aware of how dangerous they can be.
Well said. We've gone through the events leading up to Renisha McBride's death. We've analyzed the legal stuff, and we've looked at the role of race and implicit bias. But there's one piece left.
What's that?
We need to understand what was going on in Theodore Wafer's head that night.
You mean his state of mind?
What led him to make those choices? Was it fear? Prejudice? Some messed up sense of justice?
Now you're getting to the heart of it.
Yeah.
To really get this case, we need to go deeper and figure out what psychological factors might have contributed to this tragedy.
Exactly. Let's dive into the mind of Theodore Wafer and try to untangle all the emotions, beliefs, and experiences that might have shaped his actions on that terrible night.
We've talked about the legalities, the timeline, even that strange 3-hour gap.
Yeah.
Now let's try to get inside Theodore Wafer's head that night.
Okay, imagine you're asleep. It's 4:30 in the morning.
Yeah.
And suddenly there's this pounding on your door.
Bang, bang, bang.
It's pitch black, it's pouring rain,
Oh.
and you're in a neighborhood known for crime.
You'd be freaked out.
Wouldn't you? That fear, it's instinctive.
Yeah, fight or flight takes over.
Your mind's racing, trying to figure out what's happening. How dangerous is it?
Makes sense.
And remember, Wafer kept saying he felt threatened.
Right.
He even said he heard banging, crying noises from his porch, adding to the chaos.
It would definitely make things feel more urgent, more scary.
It sounds like he was already expecting trouble, maybe even exaggerating the sounds to justify what he did.
It's possible.
Yeah.
And we have to think about what it's like living in a high-crime area.
Yeah.
Dearborn Heights, back then it had a lot of crime.
Right.
That constant worry about danger, it could have warped how Wafer saw things.
So even before Renisha got to his porch, he might have been on edge already.
Exactly. But there's another layer here, implicit bias.
You're saying Wafer might have seen Renisha as a threat because she was black.
It's a tough topic, but we can't ignore it. Studies show implicit bias can make people link black people with danger.
Even when it's not clear what's happening.
Right. So even if Renisha was just confused and looking for help, Wafer's biases might have made him see her as a dangerous intruder.
That's awful.
That's a terrible thought. His fear may be made worse by the situation and possibly by bias, could have completely messed with his judgment.
Leading him to open the door and confront her with a shotgun.
A loaded shotgun.
But he chose to open the door. He could have stayed inside for force. Called the police. Why go out there and face the threat?
Good question. Some psychologists think certain personality types, people who need to be in control or who can't stand uncertainty, they're more likely to fight back in stressful situations.
But maybe Wafer opening the door wasn't just about fear, but about taking control.
Instead of asking for help, he wanted to handle it himself.
Yeah.
And think about his age. He was 55.
Yeah.
Maybe he felt vulnerable, like he had to prove he could take care of things.
So it's like fear, possible bias, personality, his age, all mixing together at that moment.
Leading to a tragedy that couldn't be undone. It shows how complicated we are, how things we don't even realize affect our choices and can have terrible results.
It's a lot to take in. This case doesn't give us easy answers, but it makes us face some hard truths about ourselves and the world.
And maybe that's what's important about these deep dives. It's not always about finding solutions or blaming someone. It's about dealing with complexity, looking at how individual actions, systemic issues, and just how unpredictable people can be all come together.
This case also shows the limits of the legal system. Even with a conviction, it doesn't feel like justice was truly done.
And that overturned manslaughter charge, it was technically right, but it doesn't change anything for Wafer.
Yeah, but it does make you think about how complicated and inconsistent the law can be.
It reminds us that justice isn't always clear-cut. There are always shades of gray, unintended outcomes and room for improvement.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I keep thinking, what if we focus less on punishing people and more on stopping these things from happening in the first place?
What if we really tried to understand why people are afraid and violent? What if we taught empathy and understanding?
What if everyone felt safe and valued no matter their race or their situation? It's a big question, and it challenges all of us to make a world where stories like Renisha McBride's teach us something instead of just being another tragedy.
That's a powerful thought. Let's keep talking about this. Let's question our own biases and work towards a future where these things don't happen anymore.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into a really tough case. It's a story that should stay with us, make us think critically about the world, and push us to fight for a better future, one that's more just and compassionate.